Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the American Academy in Rome. I'm Lindsay Harris, the Andrew Heiskell Arts Director at the Academy and curator of the exhibition From Las Vegas to Rome, Photographs by Iwan Baan. I want to begin our event together this evening with a few words of gratitude. Exhibitions and tonight's opening conversation at the Academy are only possible thanks to a host of dedicated people behind the scenes who support them. This includes the Richard Grubman and Caroline Mortimer Photographer in Residence Fund, which has generously supported the exhibition, the Helen Frankenthaler Foundation, which supports the Academy's annual Conversazioni from the American Academy in Rome series, which tonight's discussion opens, and Bloomberg Philanthropies. It also includes the Academy's director, Elisa Wong, and the Academy's arts programming staff. I want to signal out in particular Lexi Eberspacher, the linchpin behind everything of the installation that you'll see this evening, as well as Ann Colson, Laura Cabezas, and our printing, framing, and installation team, who as always have been consummate professionals from start to finish. As you will soon see upstairs in our galleries, this is a show that brings together nearly 70 photographs of Rome and Las Vegas to encourage us to see anew key elements that these two cities, perhaps oddly, have in common: spectacle, tourism, globalism, innovation, mass appeal, abundance of visual information, and limited natural resources. Above all, as Denise, Scott Brown, Robert Venturi, and Stephen Eisenhower observed, quote, each city is an archetype rather than a prototype, an exaggerated example from which to derive lessons for the typical, end quote. They made this remark in their landmark publication of 1972, Learning from Las Vegas, the cover of the first edition of which you see here, which asserted that lessons of the American desert town that those lessons equaled that of the eternal city. Quote, Las Vegas is to the Strip what Rome is to the Piazza, they concluded. Both cities emerge in their volume as archetypes of architectural communication through cutting-edge visual techniques grounded in photography. Marking the book's 50th anniversary, From Las Vegas to Rome takes Scott Brown and Venturi's study as a springboard to reconsider the lessons both cities offer us in the 21st century. Ours is an era of global tourism, pandemic lockdowns, climate change, and new ways of leveraging money and power to shape the urban landscape, an issue at the heart of patronage, which is the theme that guides much of the public programming at the Academy this year. In its images and installation, the exhibition also responds to photographic innovations in the book, which encourage us to rethink color, scale, collage effects, aerial perspectives, and seriality. That includes innovative uses of contemporary photographs of the era, like Ed Ruscha's views of the Las Vegas Strip, and they, I think, welcome an invitation from a photographer like Iwan to reconsider photography as a way to interpret place. Two people are at the core of the exceptional exhibition that we are opening tonight, and we are fortunate enough to have them with us this evening in conversation, Mark Robbins and Iwan Baan. President of the American Academy in Rome for the past decade, Mark is also a photographer and curator with a deep knowledge of architecture and its history. His unique set of expertise has helped to establish the Academy as one of the most dynamic cultural institutions in Rome, which itself, I've come to understand, is one of the most dynamic cultural cities in the world. A distinctive aspect of the Academy's program, which Mark has done so much to define, is its slate of residents who every year fuel the intellectual and creative exchange of ideas at the core of the Academy's mission. This year, we are delighted to welcome Iwan Baan, the Academy's 2023 Richard Grubman and Caroline Mortimer Photographer in Residence. Iwan takes photographs, for those of you who don't know, that are in essence images that reveal human experiences and interactions with architecture and built environments. The places he has worked span the globe, from Las Vegas and Rome to Kampala, Uganda, and pilgrim routes in the mountains of Mexico. In the past year alone, audiences in Rennes, London, and Sharjah, to name just a few places, took in Iwan's stunning photographs of vernacular structures in Burkina Faso. Commissioned by the lighting company Zoomtobel, Iwan took the photographs using only the brilliant sunlight that illuminates the West African landscape. The result was Momentum of Light, an award-winning book and traveling exhibition that Iwan produced with 2022 Pritzker Architecture Prize winner Francis Kéré. Iwan's exhibitions, What Architects Owe Photographers and Image Building, How Photography Transform Architecture, indicate, I think, the power with which his work pushes these disciplines in new directions. The show of his photographs, 52 Weeks, 52 Cities, which traveled for over 2 years, only hints at the global reach and impact of his art. I will also say that Iwan and his studio are an absolute delight to work with, and I think that this is another factor that has contributed to his well-earned and renown worldwide. So with that, I would like you please to join me in welcoming Iwan to the podium, followed by a conversation between him and our president, Mark Robbins. Thank you very much.
Thank you for this wonderful introduction and the opportunities to show my work here at the American Academy. I want to start with a small introduction on my work for those who don't know my work. I've been photographing basically since I was a kid and started photography, went to art school, did much more documentary photography in the beginning, but in 2004, 2005, I kind of met by accident Rem Koolhaas, the Dutch architect, and it was an interesting moment there in the office where a lot of projects were finished and a big one was just starting. So I proposed him to document the construction of CCTV in China. And I knew nothing really about architecture, but I felt like there was a big change happening in China with the run-up to the Olympic Games, how these buildings were coming up, these masses of people building these buildings literally almost by hand. There were all migrant workers coming from the countryside, living there on these construction sites with a building like CCTV. There were at times 10,000 migrant workers working on a construction site like that, who lived there, who had all their sort of daily routines there, and at the same time were building these incredible buildings. So for me it was a story like on how these cities were built, the migration of these people, around these construction sites which were displaced, and how that city was rapidly changing around that time. It was these two leaning towers going up to 250 meters high and then connecting up in the air. So this incredible structure, and you felt that kind of architecture and that structure already, like from the early beginning, like the way these two towers going up under an angle, and that's a structure which is all exposed and transparent during construction and slowly being finished. So that was a project I've been working on for many years. And right at that time, it was also like, yeah, all the start of the construction of for the Olympics, the Olympic Stadium, which I documented for Herzog and de Meuron. And again, like these incredible juxtapositions of these people who come from the countryside, probably never seen a building of more than 2 stories high, who built these buildings, live there on site, having sort of their daily routines, watching TV with these kind of incredible structures in the background rising behind them, up to the finishing and in the opening of the Olympic Games here in 2008. So from there, I started working with a lot of architects, but I've been always fascinated with also that context, showing not only kind of the architectural details, but where these buildings are, the context, how they're used, how they're taken over by people. And for instance, here I was in 2010 at the opening of the Maxi Museum for Zaha Hadid, and like really stepping away from these details and showing it in the context of the city has been always an important part of my work, where the building almost mimics the shape of the river here. So yeah, a lot of the commissioned work has always been around these buildings, but I'm trying to go more and more also back to yeah, my documentary past and showing that context and where these buildings are, how they're used, how they're abused, also how they're taken over, and like the sort of these incredible shapes of Zaha Hadid. But then when you zoom out and you see it in the context of Baku, Azerbaijan, and sort of that city which is in a constant change, really shows these incredible juxtapositions. But also like going back to older architecture. This was for a book I did in 2010 on Brasilia and Chandigarh, these two cities which were built at that point 50 and 60 years earlier, and how these cities are taken over, are changed, how people use basically every nook and corner of these cities in sometimes very different ways than the architects have intended and planned for, are for me like really the inspiration to see these buildings, and they become really sort of the backdrop of everyday life. And also like under any kind of weather condition, like it can be in the pouring rain, but like it shows like that atmosphere in a place which I'm really fascinated by. And it's all sort of in the moment. This was a series I did with Manuel Hertz, architect from Zurich, where we did a book on the modernist history in Africa, where we visited 5 countries, all in their moments of independence and independence building. So a little bit like Brasilia, Chandigarh, an important moment for these countries in change, and how they created their architecture through an identity through architecture. And we're currently working on a new volume there, where we're documenting Lagos, Nigeria, and Tanzania, which has an incredible wealth of architectural history, which has hardly been documented. But like what I really love in these places, like also the way people dress and the buildings and everything is incredibly colorful, and like their dresses become almost like architecture in a way. These are some of the images from which will be in the new book on Nigeria. So yeah, these aerial views are an important part of my sort of visual language of how to place these buildings in the context. Like I'm traveling non-stop, and often I wake up in the morning and I hardly know where I am. So for me, it's also like it's sort of stepping back and showing the city and like how the city has been developed around it. Here we're in Dubai, and the absurdity of these places, also with a tower of 800 meters in a largely empty and low-rise place. How these cities grow, the proximity, the infrastructure, and so on, like always important themes in my work. And like it reveals so much of a city, like also the intents of an architect, like for instance here with Brasilia, where you really see that the idea of Oscar Niemeyer with the bird-shaped a plan of the city. Los Angeles with its incredible highway network, which kind of lights up at night. Or Miami, where you literally see like this city which is like inches above the water. Like these things I feel like are incredibly revealing once you see them from the air, and the fragility also of a place like that. For instance, here I was in Houston working on a project there on that infrastructure of the highways, the oil, and so on. Like it's literally built all just inches above the water, and the proximity of people living, the heavy industries, and how these how these cities are developing over time. New York, which I've photographed from the air over many times, and I was there kind of by accident on this moment in 2000. 12 when the superstorm Sandy hit the city and blacked out half the city for almost a week. I rented a helicopter. I thought that was the only moment where you could really see, the only way that you could really see like the absence of light, which is such an important part, of course, for photography, but to show that big contrast between these two parts of the city. And how cities grow and develop over time. For instance, here you see Kyoto with these large parts of the imperial palaces, these mega blocks in the city, and then the incredible sort of pixelation of how the city around it grew. Or Tokyo, which is developed all around the waterways, and these waterways you still see in the pattern of the city. And these things you see coming back and forth, also like in developing places. Here you see Caracas with all the informal cities, like literally draped over the hills. Or Kibera in Nairobi, this incredible informal settlement, which is like looking from above, this almost continuous steel roof of corrugated steel, rusty corrugated steel, and the small alleyways in between, and how people built their structures under these very complicated circumstances themselves. So I quickly want to show you a few images of the book. You mentioned also Momentum of Light, which came out of a trip I did with Francis Queré last year to Burkina Faso. 3 places in Burkina Faso we visited, which were long on my list to see. This is Tchébele, this incredible village with these houses which have been decorated with beautiful patterns. Everything is these mud houses, and the book and the exhibition is all about the sort of stark contrast in these places. You have the abundance of light during the day. These houses are all built from thick mud walls to keep the heat and the light out, make it a comfortable climate inside. But this idea of these houses, which are all built out of the earth, and it's all the same material, where floors, walls, ceilings, everything becomes one, and the people living in these places, and the structures, the incredible patterns and drawings on these buildings, and how that all history developed there. These houses are incredibly dark inside, so your eyes have to adapt to that light, and slowly these interiors sort of reveal themselves, and you see the insides of these houses. So at night, of course, there's no electricity. It started out of this commission for Zumtobel, a lighting manufacturer. We made a book of a place showing no electricity and no light, and only the natural light and the sort of incredible darkness. And that's something we translated also in the book with a special way of printing on black paper, where it really emphasized these few light moments. So when Lindsay called me in April, I think, inviting me to do a show here, she said, like, don't you have anything in Italy? Because Italians, they love to see Italy. And I didn't really have anything at that moment. But it was right around the time that I was visiting Las Vegas out of my own interest. I was passing through, I was working on another commission there in the area in Nevada and Arizona, and I've been always fascinated with Las Vegas. I visited twice shortly before in the last 20 years, but never really spent time there. And I had just spent a couple days there and photographed just for myself. And of course, like everywhere there, you see Rome reflected in the city. So then we realized, it's 50 years ago that Learning from Las Vegas was done. So let's look at these two cities, Rome and Las Vegas, in a new way, and see what happened there. And of course, a lot has changed there in the last 50 years. This is in a city which is like, it feels like it's made of cardboard, everything, and it is in a constant change. And everything is sort of this decor in the middle of the desert, the astroturf, which is draped everywhere, the sort of mass tourism, which is everywhere visible. And then you have this incredible backdrop of all these structures, and this complete juxtaposition of where everything gets compressed. The whole world is in this one little strip pushed together. And that sort of flatness was immediately something which what struck me. And yeah, of course, the references to Italy, to Rome, which are everywhere there. But like in the end, it's only about these gambling machines, and then that sort of whole pastiche environment around it, and sort of that endlessness. Like it must have been a completely different Las Vegas when Denise and Robert were there 50 years ago. Like I don't think there's any building standing there anymore from that time, and it became only bigger and bigger and more, and it's just this relentlessness of endless surfaces which are replicated and continued, and then it's almost like the Photoshop stamp, which is like copy paste endlessly over everything. And yeah, the columns which are coming back, but when you look up closely, like there's the USB socket in there. So for the convenience, for the people endlessly scrolling on their iPhones, on their Instagrams, and this sort of endless boredom and excess, and what all comes back there. So I did a whole series of aerials there also, and like from the sky, like you sort of peek into that absurdity. All it's the very thin veil of these facades you see kind of wrapping around. Everything looks really like cardboard, or like a model, and the scale it becomes like a scaleless place almost. And then the backside of these places, yeah, it's a total afterthought. It's just infrastructure, again, like a super thin facade sort of pasted in front of it at the moments where people step out of their elevator, step out of their hotel room, and for the rest it's all this sort of total fantasy interior world. But when you look at the backside of Las Vegas, like it's a whole other weird visual spectacle of like small strip malls, the endless glass curtain walls. In the middle of the desert is sort of no man's land, where here and there some people are walking around in the other relentless heat. The infrastructure of the parking garages, the air conditioning systems, which kind of snake through all these places, and it just goes on and on. And then the backside of the city, the homeless people, which are sort of hiding out in every corner in the shade wherever they can. And again, like sort of zooming out, seeing it from above, like it's almost this completely mechanical city. To me, it almost looks like a computer chip you're looking at, with the very few moments of some color, like the excess of gold, which reflects on the sort of endless gray concrete surfaces. And then you see there in the background Lake Mead, the source of life literally for the city, a lake which is disappearing fast now, drying up, but like it's also like an important part of that infrastructure of the city, and the airport, which brings everyone right in the center of the city. It's almost like a minute's walk from your airplane straight to the strip, and it's this little strip in the middle of this endless city of small houses and concrete in the middle of the desert, where a few artificial green spaces are stay together. So in a way, yeah, a complete opposite as from Rome, but also I found many similarities. Rome, of course, when you zoom out here, this aerial view, the river, which is also like the lifeline of the city, where the city is built all around it. You see all the monuments from above, that incredible patina of the city, all the rich layers of the city, how that's developed over time. But at some moments, it also, yeah, because of that patina, became a sort of a flatness over the city. You can feel that in this image of the Vatican, where it's also these layers, but it's also like it becomes a kind of big decor in my images on the city. And I was here like in the middle of the summer. It was like almost 40 degrees Celsius. This relentless heat. It was the first summer after COVID, so the masses of tourists came back, and it felt like also in a way very similar to Las Vegas. Like here we're in the below the Vatican, in the cafeteria, where the walls are another kind of pasted view outside in another artificial background pasted on the walls, and then the masses of tourists, all with their cell phones, all sweaty and drippy, and the water dripping and the heat, and that was something I really tried to capture. And then looking from above, you see these few moments where like all these people come together. Like we were flying here over the Trevi Fountain, and then like in a way it's not so different. Like it's also like this super thin facade which is pasted against the wall, and where everyone comes together and takes their selfies, and it's these masses of people in that heat and that chaos and that exhaustion, and people sitting down on any sort of found object. Like here, these objects are hundreds or thousands of years old, but in other than that, there's not so much difference I felt in these places. The vendors who drape their water on the old columns, kind of almost in a similar way as the Foro Romano. And people becoming one with their environment, and that's beautiful orange-brown color, which is sort of replicated all as a kind of universal patina almost over the whole city. And then, Rome, unlike Las Vegas, like you cannot have much outdoor advertising. These buildings are all protected, but Valentino can rent the Spanish Steps for a weekend and have a fashion show with all these models on their high heels tumbling down the Spanish Steps, and have huge billboards on the buildings at that moment. Or when buildings are under renovation, they put these faux facades on top of them. And that's the moment where you can blast your advertising also off. And in that way, it becomes almost also like another Las Vegas. And around these faux facades, the plants which are creeping up. So yeah, it's a total different world, but at the same time also a very similar feeling what I got with these two places. And what really struck me with the development of Las Vegas, and having seen, of course, the book and the research from 50 years ago, and like the direction where the city is going in, like it's literally like it's what I was telling before, like it feels like this sort of endless computer chip you're looking at, and all these endless spaces which are copy paste of patterns, almost like in your in the metaverse, in the 3D games, which are like endless replications of the same patterns and fillers of space, which just goes on and on. So I really feel like these spaces, like the next step, it will be kind of becoming the metaverse, and like these people watching their cell phones, like being on Instagram, and you see that already happening. Like with these, this is a large entertainment space, kind of covered walkway with shops and entertainment in the north of Las Vegas, and that whole structure is like lined with LED lights. It's just this completely immersive world of 3D image projection, LED projection, where people walk through, literally fly through on zip lines, and it's sort of this and more and endless entertainment what the city is. So you wonder what would be the next step, and like the metaverse, the 3D version of the city is not so far off. And like, do you still really need to travel to these places, or will it become all virtual? And like, there's this ginormous dome being built, and it will be covered with 1.5 million LED screens inside and outside the space. So this will be this completely immersive environment, and you ask, like, why do we really need to be there? And like, you could be kind of anywhere and into that space. People still want to travel to these places, but it could be also in the end Rome, which is coming back into these places, but in a completely virtual way. So thank you so much.
Technology.
I know, we're all getting there.
What can I say? God, oh, this is probably too close, or is it reverb? That was wonderful, just incredible. I think we're all somewhat exhausted visually by being taken through amazing architecture around the world, and being made to confront cities and identity. They're just remarkable images, and I haven't seen Iwan in about 12 years, but we had done a show, I think it was 52 cities, 52 weeks when I was the dean at Syracuse. But before we go to that, I have to recognize how wonderful the show looks, and thank you so much for doing that. And
thanks for this opportunity.
To Lindsay, really, with the whole team, for framing this.
Absolutely. Thank you.
You know, Lindsay had given a talk about the relationship between photography and place in Rome, which was wonderful. It should be online if you get a chance. Listen to it, because this is a through line in how we know places through photography or through representation, and you're so acute there. And then one other link before we enter into a conversation is really Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown's place at the Academy and also in Rome. So they were here from 54 to 56 as fellows, and the first book that was produced by the team was Complexity and Contradiction, looking at the way that buildings perform and are read. This also has to do with reading architecture. And then Learning from Las Vegas grew out of a studio, as many of you know, at Yale. And so what's compelling is what you're seeing was the outcome of research about the Strip. And this is where Venturi and Scott Brown, working together, came up with these two poles of thinking about architecture. It was the duck and the decorated shed. And so these are all, they were a real hybrid between decorated sheds and ducks. A duck is something that subsumes its form, or its form subsumes all of its function, and it's called a duck, and he's referencing a Long Island duck farm that is in the shape of a duck. So and it has a door actually in the side of the duck. So it has nothing really to do with the function except that it is a sign and symbol for what's going on inside. And then he talks about the decorated shed, which is Las Vegas, or it doesn't matter whether you have the Empire State Building or the Paris skyline glued onto this thing. It's basically a box that contains these kinds of activities. So the experience of history that both Scott Brown and Venturi have here is so deeply embedded in their understanding of architecture. We're in this amazing Baroque city, which is about presentation, whether it's power of the church or you know, power of the state or power of the king. All of the monuments that you showed sort of represent this kind of power. But I think the work that you're showing, and this goes back to training as an architect and as a curator of architecture, you always feel a little bit at a disadvantage because when you're showing architecture, you're almost always showing representation rather than the thing itself, right? So you depend, really, so I wonder if you could say something about the relationship between the architect and Rem in terms of his Rem Koolhaas, in terms of his attitude towards architecture, and how you worked together, because you basically are reframing the work. So what is that dialogue like?
Like I come from a completely different background. When I started working with him, I didn't know anything about architecture. I still feel I look from a different perspective to that. But I was lucky to start with him because I think he saw something in my work. I didn't change much in my way of photographing. Like I've been always photographing basically the same way since I started as a 12-year-old in a way. But he saw something, I think, in my work, and I was at a moment where I suddenly realized that with that subject matter I could sort of incorporate all my interest. And I think photography is also, it's a sort of endless curiosity you try to feed, where you can go to places where you otherwise don't really belong, and you can feel at home, and you can be the sort of fly on the wall and see what happens there. And for me, that's a big drive, and architecture in a way enabled that even further for me.
Do you ever get critiques from the architects whose work you're photographing, or direction from them about their image of the building and the kinds of things they want to see presented?
In the very beginning, I got it a few times, but I think for me, it's important. I try to go also to places without too much prior knowledge, be as a sort of, I think that first experience of a place, which is totally foreign to me, is very important to see what's also what's the difference to the place where I came 2 days ago from, and what's new. And for so many things, people take so much of their built environment for granted, I think. And but when you come in with a fresh eye, with from a totally different background, you see all the different ways. And I think also with the work I'm doing in Africa, the African modernism, you see all these structures, they've been there for 50 years. They're all in a way, often they're dilapidated, in a bad condition, but at the same time, they were really important structures at the time, and people take them for granted, they fall apart. People think, oh, that's an old building, but there was some incredible thinking and ideology and so behind it. And to see that now 50 years later, and it still makes sense, and it's actually, it was a very exciting and special moment that these structures were built, and a lot of that is being demolished and replaced these days. So we felt it was an important moment to document these structures, and again, kind of from an outsider view, and showing how these structures are used in very different ways.
No, it's interesting because this is a resource for all of us. I mean, Brasilia and Chandigarh are well-known cities that were built, and the dialogue between the larger context, which thankfully you always show, because zooming out gives you such a better sense. The Zaha Hadid, it's kind of incredible to see that in broader context, because that's often not captured in photographs. But the modernism of smaller independent states, and especially in Africa, are not very well known. And when you go to Nairobi, it's kind of remarkable.
A complete discovery in these places, and there was never also really documentation about these things. So that was Manuel and his team really dove into there to uncover also that history, how these places were built.
And do you ever think about the impact on students and architects, reacquainting them with this kind of mid-century vision of an architecture of independence and liberty and, before postmodernism?
I don't know, like for me, like I think all these things are in a way, like I approach them all in the same way. If I'm shooting the total vernacular and traditional, or the modernist, or a new commission for an architect, like I think they're all stories on very specific moments in time that these places were built, on the necessity of these places. And for instance, with the vernacular work also, like it was so local at the time where everything was still so local. Like it came really out of the ground there in front, where they built these structures with their own hands. They didn't need anything shipped in from far away. It's the sort of the most sustainable way of living in a way, but also like it's something which is disappearing incredibly fast at the moment. So that's why I feel there's also an urgency to document these things. And I think as an architect, I hope people learn a lot from these things as well.
But it's also, I'm struck by your lack of kind of bias or sort of judging either the vernacular work or the high, sort of what we call architecture with a capital A. And that seems very much in sync with Venturi. At the time Venturi is doing this work, just before Peter Blake, a British architect, had written a book called God's Own Junkyard, which was bemoaning the fact of the loss of community and urban life given suburban sprawl and also the strip, right? And so what's fascinating with Venturi is he comes in and he wants to look at how this operates, and he brings the same systems of analysis that you would use if you were looking at Brunelleschi or Alberti, except he brings it to bear on this stuff which is thought about as completely commercially driven, forgettable, thin, cardboard, as you said, architecture. So I liked what you said about the kind of newness of the experience. Do you find that when you land in a place, do you do research beforehand, or do you like the kind of fresh view of the outsider?
In a way, it's often that fresh view of the outsider, I think, which helps me a lot to notice things. Like, it's a very intuitive way of working. Like, I work handheld, very lightweight, not really with tripods or assistants or equipment. So it's very much sort of in what happens right there at that moment, and what that relationship of people in space is like in very different moments. Like, for instance, when it's a new commissioned building, and it's the moment of the opening, and it's something incredible, new contemporary architecture. I feel also people behave differently in an unknown space, and like sort of these moments you try to bring out to where like it's this centuries old vernacular which people are completely part with their environment, and like they don't notice their background anymore, and they take that for granted. So it's you play with all these elements constantly.
Yeah, it's I sometimes think the fact that you're neither Italian and looking at Rome, and you're not American, and you're looking at what is often a stand-in for an American sort of consumer-driven sensibility, gives you this kind of wonderful way of just looking at the color, the light. It's, you know, bringing quite an open vision to this, and because there is a fabulousness and in its awful quality, right? Totally. Really, it's like Versailles on steroids, right? It's just mirrors reflecting, awful carpeting, huge patterns, and so it out-Baroques the Baroque. And so, and you have joy in recording this kind of outsized, over-the-top, hyperbolic kind of architecture, and you clearly enjoy it. So when you were thinking about pairing these two cities, what were you thinking? I mean, was this already in your mind when you were photographing in Rome, bringing in the Las Vegas parts, or was this something that happened in the midst?
Yeah, like of course we spoke about it, but I didn't know Rome very well. Like I've been here maybe 2 or 3 times before, and it was usually for a commission, like you come in and out for a couple days, and never had really time to more time here to spend. So when this came in, I was delighted to spend some more time here. It was like the midst of the summer, not the ideal time, but in the end actually also the ideal time, because it's really emphasized this kind of excess and the more and more of everything, and I think that's something which is really became part of this series, and which, like, I feel like all these aspirations from people, like they're all similar in a way, in very different environments, and it just feels like a lot of these things become denser and denser and bigger at the moment, and you're curious where that will end.
You know, the photographs are just lovely upstairs, and there's a wonderful materiality. We talked about that yesterday. Can you say something about how you approach the presentation of the images? And you're very conscious of the quality of the paper, the density, the opacity of the paper.
So I often use it's fairly standard paper, but it has a very matte quality, and usually for collector, you frame it, you mount it behind glass, so you lose a little bit sort of the tactility, but I love that paper also to use it kind of bare and open. And so here we used it just in frames. There's no glass in front of it, and it creates a kind of softness and tactility of the prints, where you almost you want to touch, and you can zoom into any detail. You don't have reflections, and you almost feel like you're sucked into the places.
No, it's they're very beautiful and very lush. It's as if they're printed on flocking or velvet. They have this deepness, especially in the darks. You know, you'll see this upstairs when you look at these amazing rows of umbrella pines, and they just are just enough shadow to make out the contours, but very deep. And I asked you if you had gone in and burned, that means bring out the highlights in some of the images. You said, no, I haven't manipulated these a lot.
No, I don't do any Photoshop editing in that sense. But then these two subjects are, of course, already so rich in color and in content and everything. You don't have to emphasize anything. It just pops off.
If I could, clearly people have always been a part of reflecting the experience of a space. And, you often see people returning your gaze. And how is that for you as a photographer? You know, thinking about photographing people in public space, their responses, and how do you think about that in terms of informing something about the architecture or the culture of the city?
I think the behavior of people is very much part of the way I photograph these places, and to show what people are doing there. And sometimes they see me, and they react to the photographer, but often they're also in their own world, and that's something which, especially here in Rome and Las Vegas, it's like people are completely in their own world, like either behind a gambling machine or on their screen, or in this sort of exhaustive environment, that relentlessness of everything else, all these inputs. So I felt like, especially in these two places, people hardly notice you, and like everyone walks around with a camera or their phone and see these places through their screens and so on. So that was also really something what struck me, seeing Las Vegas now, which must be such a completely different experience from 50 years ago.
Absolutely.
That it's all just consumed through that screen.
It's actually interesting 60s, mid-century modern, you know, the old Sands and the old Caesar's Palace, which is much more like Brunetti's Piazza, and that's all gone. You know, just one last point. Iwan has a fantastic Instagram feed. So if you want to stay in touch, I watch the progress from movies and the series that you're working on, Africa. It's all fantastic because you can do this travel. I don't know how you keep this straight with your family and your kids. And
we took them everywhere, basically, always.
Which was
so
great,
that's the only way
wonderful.
to
so they're learning a lot. But the last couple of images have reflected fashion shoots, and we were talking about this last night, and I didn't know that that's actually where you had started. When you were doing, you had done, early on, you had done fashion work?
I didn't really do fashion work myself so much, but in the third year of art school, you have to do a year of apprenticeships, and I thought it was interesting to see how a fashion photographer works. So one of my internships was with a fashion photographer in New York. But after that, I never really looked, and I don't know anything about fashion either. I have a sort of uniform I always carry because I live out of a suitcase and cannot think too much about it. But it was funny, I met the owner of Acris, this Swiss fashion label, I think already 12 years ago. He's very connected with the architecture field and good friends with Jacques and Pierre Herzog and Meron. So through that network, and ever since he's been asking me to shoot fashion, which I kind of refused because I didn't really know what to add there. But it was now their 100th anniversary, so we thought now it was a nice moment to combine fashion and architecture. Actually, the book is also a lot about architecture and the history of St. Gallen, the city where it was born, and I could bring it back again a little bit to my own.
No, absolutely. It's a wonderful fusion. Well, I know we're out of time, but please join us for the exhibition upstairs. The images are phenomenal. Thank you so much for this work. Thank you, Lindsay. Really beautiful.
And thanks also to Mark.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Please join us upstairs. There's a reception there. The galleries are open. We ask you to keep your masks on inside the gallery, but otherwise you're free to roam around. Enjoy it. It's a special show. And thank you so much to Mark and to Iwan for illuminating everything that's behind it. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Learned so much about everything.